Morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Lauren Reese, and together with my colleagues at the Wilson Center and our partners at NOAA, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's event on the significance of the coming El Nino. The headlines over the last several days since NOAA announced El Nino's arrival, and with it, an increase in global temperatures and more extreme weather around the world. The El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, is a natural phenomenon that has occurred for thousands of years. It's not new, but in an era increasingly shaped by climate change, El Nino is also changing. So what we wanted to do with today's event is bring together a panel of experts to help us unpack the science of El Nino, help us understand what it means for communities and countries around the world, and identify the kinds of investments and responses that contribute to the resilience of communities facing extreme weather. To kick off today's discussion, we've invited Maxine Burkett to provide some scene-setting remarks. Maxine is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans, Fisheries, and Polar Affairs in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. She previously served as an expert senior advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, and as a professor of law at the University of Hawaii, and is a visiting professor at Harvard Medical School's Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. Maxine's also a former global fellow with the Wilson Center and has long been a go-to resource for her expertise on a number of topics, including climate-related migration, small island states, and climate and peace. Over to you, Maxine.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today and introduce this excellent panel. This is a critical topic, and I'm looking forward to the insights of all of the experts the Wilson Center has assembled. I join you today from Washington, D.C., where just last week we experienced some of the worst air quality our region has ever seen due to the raging wildfires our neighbors are battling in Canada. Fires made far worse and far more common because of climate change. It is impossible to ignore the many ways in which our changing climate is wreaking havoc on the health of our planet and our communities. Given my current role at the State Department, I'll focus on issues related to the ocean, the poles and fisheries, and on those who rely on them, acknowledging, of course, that the climate crisis and events like El Nino impact the entire world and all its systems. There are already serious effects on the ocean, for example. The ocean absorbs nearly 90% of the excess heat caused by climate change, and it is changing our marine ecosystems. In some places, ocean warming has already reduced fisheries productivity by as much as 35%. Ocean warming, along with runoff and pollution, unsustainable and destructive fishing practices, and coastal development is also decimating coral reefs around the world. In 2022 alone, warming waters connected to climate change resulted in coral bleaching in 91% of reefs surveyed along the Great Barrier Reef, marking the fourth large-scale coral bleaching event in the last 6 years. And sea level rise is already causing damage to infrastructure, intensifying and quickening shoreline erosion, and threatening coastal ecosystems around the world. The ocean, marine life, and communities that rely on both are truly bearing the brunt of climate impacts. And this year, those stresses are going to be further exacerbated by the El Nino Southern Oscillation. NOAA officially issued an El Nino advisory last Thursday, and this event formed earlier than most El Ninos in the past and is likely to strengthen. As I'm sure Dr. Kapnick will elaborate, scientists are already warning us that this event will likely be different and more intense than El Ninos in the past. That means the impacts on marine resources and the communities that depend on them for food and livelihoods will also be different and more intense. We know that El Nino will cause ocean waters in the Eastern Pacific, already steadily warming as our planet warms, to get even hotter. And we know that El Nino will depress the upwelling system off the coast of South America that brings cool, oxygen, and nutrient-rich waters to fuel its ecosystems. These fundamental changes to the ocean environment are closely linked to fisheries. They will affect economically important marine species, ranging from shellfish to small pelagic fish like sardines and anchovies to larger predators like tuna. The effects of El Nino on these species are both complicated and comprehensive, and include changes in population, relative abundance, growth, range. Because every El Nino event is unique, it's incredibly difficult to predict the impact of a specific El Nino year on any one fishery, for example. And then adding climate change to that equation makes that prediction even harder. Some marine species may expand their range to take advantage of warmer water. In other species, we may see mass mortality events, lower reproduction, stunted growth, or migration to cooler waters. A major consequence of El Nino is the loss of commercially important species where they usually occur. And this means that fishers face dramatic changes in catch volume and in the dominant species their nets bring in. This can mean major economic losses. During the 2015 to 2016 El Nino, California squid landings declined by 65%, equaling a financial loss of $48 million. And El Nino's impact can be equally devastating for tribal and subsistence fishers in communities that depend on the ocean to provide their food security and livelihoods, and in some respects, culture. Fishers were the first to notice El Nino, and fishers remain among those who are most affected by the changes of El Nino and what those changes bring to the ocean. The United States is taking steps to support these communities, particularly coastal and small island communities who are among the most vulnerable to climate change. One example is through the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, or PREPARE. We're working to put early warning systems and climate information into the hands of people who need it, including the coastal and fishing communities that will be impacted by El Nino, so that they can prepare for coming changes. PREPARE will also build the resilience of health, water, and infrastructure systems stressed by climate change and further stressed by El Nino, as well as mobilizing resources for adaptation, including from vast, diverse contributors like private capital. We're also strongly supportive of CMAR. This is a joint effort between Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Ecuador to secure, protect, and conserve the Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor. CMAR will help foster and sustain healthy, biodiverse marine communities in the Eastern Pacific so that the ecosystem is not already in a state of stress when those additional impacts like the ones brought on by El Nino occur. In 2022, the United States and CMAR countries signed a memorandum of understanding to work together to strengthen marine governance, maritime security, and marine conservation finance to help ensure the success of this initiative. The United States is also continuing to work with regional fisheries management organizations in the Pacific to truly foster sustainable, climate resilient management of the shared fish stocks that are especially important for small island communities and economies. Events like El Nino underscore the complexities of our climate system and the challenges we face in addressing its impacts. There is no one-size-fits-all response to the climate crisis because there is no one predictable way in which climate change will affect an ecosystem or community. Events like this also remind us that climate change is not happening in a vacuum. Extreme weather events and recurring changes like El Nino will continue to occur and further disrupt life for communities that are already contending with the sort of everyday climate impacts that we face now on a regular basis. In addition to dramatically reducing emissions, we need to be ready to provide rapid, varied, and nuanced responses to support communities like fishers that will invariably be harmed by this El Nino. While this is a daunting challenge, we also have many tools in our toolbox. So the task now is to be ready to both deploy them and build on them. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Lauren, to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maxine. I think you really underscored sort of the many intricate systems that are connected and how human activity interacts with those and where there are potential entry points to really help sort of build the resilience of both the communities, but also the natural environments on which they rely. So thank you very much for your time. I know you're very busy. Really appreciate you being with us today and hope that last week's Capitol Hill Ocean Week was a successful one for you. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much. And now I'm so pleased to turn to our panel. We're going to start with, I'm just going to introduce everybody very briefly. You have fuller bios on the event page where you're streaming this event. So just scroll down if you want to read a little bit more about these experts and their very diverse and interesting backgrounds. We're going to start with Dr. Sarah Kapnick, who is the Chief Scientist for NOAA, where she is responsible for advancing policy and program direction for NOAA's science and technology priorities. Following Dr. Kapnick, we'll hear from Rodney Martinez, who's the World Meteorological Organization's representative for North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. His primary research is ENSO and climate user interface development. Then we'll hear from Sarang Shadore, who is the Director of Studies and Senior Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute and a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks, where he recently published a discussion paper, Climate Security and Instability in the Bay of Bengal region, which I highly recommend. Finally, we'll hear from Melaku Yirga, the Ethiopia Country Director of Mercy Corps. Melaku has more than 20 years of experience leading global complex portfolios and multi-country teams in high-risk and fragile regions across the African continent. And of course, Mercy Corps is doing a lot of important work in this space. So we're very pleased to welcome you all here with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kapnick. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. We're so excited, or we're so happy to be able to have this conversation today, right on the heels of us declaring that an El Nino is here last Thursday during our monthly update on El Nino. Next slide, please. So what is El Nino? The El Nino is the warm phase of when you have these temperature differentials in the Pacific. We just came out of 3 years of a La Nina state where it was cool off the Pacific. And these temperatures in the ocean, they set up what happens with atmospheric circulation above it. So these pictures are the schematics of the differences in temperature across the ocean, but also the differences of where you're getting convection, where the air is rising, and then where that is moving around leads to all the changes around the world. Next slide, please. So why do people care? Why do we care about the development of an El Nino? So on average so El Nino versus La Nina, those are the extreme phases of when we have these temperatures in the Pacific that then set up these atmospheric circulation patterns around the world. They lead to changes in areas where you have more precipitation and less precipitation. So they lead to wet regions and dry regions around the world. So on average in past El Ninos, we see from the winter, you have more wet conditions across the southern portion of the United States when you change where the jet stream is moving. You also have wet conditions across the equatorial Pacific, but then you're also setting up dry conditions in the northern part of South America, Australia, into the islands, the Pacific Island nations, and you can also have extended changes in precipitation as well into Asia as well as to Africa. So these are the averages of what has happened in the past, and during those times in those dry places you have drought, in those wet places you can have extreme rainfall, you can have flooding, and so both sides create these changes that set up to cause problems for society, as well as changes in agricultural productivity in these different types of regions. Next slide, please. So hopefully this will start. Go back. So this is a schematic of what's been happening. So it started with, if we look inside that box, it started with a cool phase at the very beginning of this year, moving into this hot phase as it's warming up. This is the key monitoring region that we use for NOAA to be able to determine an El Nino. So this is the Niño 3.4 region. So in this region, as it starts to warm up, when we get those multi-months in a row of the warming in that region, that is when we start having the ocean El Nino in this region. If you look at the bottom right slide, that shows all the locations that we also have buoys. So we have buoys in the ocean through the Tropical Atmosphere Ocean Array, or TOW array, which was actually set up because of the really strong El Nino in 82, 83. And so we actually have stations in those locations that are monitoring all the different, they're monitoring sea surface temperature, wind speed and direction, relative humidity, temperature in the air, temperatures with depth. And so they're monitoring that to then be able to determine when an El Nino is developing in that region. Importantly, I also want to note that through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're actually upgrading the system as well, where we're adding new measurements into the ocean. We're adding barometric pressure, rain, solar radiation. We're increasing our frequency so we can have more information in this region to help us with our predictions going forward. Also of note, when NOAA makes a declaration of an El Nino, that is in this region, this Niño 3.4 region where this box is in the center of the Pacific. In Peru and on South America, you actually also can have regional warming along the coast, which can have regional effects. And so when we talk about it from NOAA, we're talking about this central region, but there are other parts of warming that are also occurring off the coast of South America that are also used for other regional indices with regional impacts in South America. But for the US, for NOAA, we are monitoring this major portion in the center, which is what leads to those larger circulation changes globally. Next slide, please. So the ocean has set up an El Nino where it's warming in that Niño 3.4 region. And we also look at the atmospheric conditions to be able to make a declaration of El Nino. So And the blue phases, those are when we have more La Nina conditions. We have just seen in this last month, this atmospheric condition has now come into an El Nino phase. So before it was not, we were waiting for the atmosphere to start setting up that change in circulation pattern, but in the last month it has. And so we have both the oceanic conditions and the atmospheric conditions now with an El Nino. Next slide, please. Additionally, our dynamic models are also now showing an El Nino occurring. It has an 84% chance of reaching a moderate El Nino by the winter during the time that it typically peaks, and a 56% chance of reaching a strong El Nino by the winter. So all those dynamical models are the ones mainly on the top that are showing this warming. So the temperature, the anomaly is the y-axis. So all the dynamical models are putting us towards an El Nino state. The statistical models are, few of them are actually neutral, but for the most part, on average, everything is pushing us towards an El Nino. Again, 56% of a strong El Nino, 84% of a moderate El Nino. And there's only a 5% chance of an El Nino does not develop long enough to be a historic episode. So there's still a chance that it won't develop, very small, that it will not. Next slide, please. So the reason people care about El Niños is because of these large scale circulation patterns and how that changes precipitation. So for the seasonal outlook that we had from last month, have most recently for looking into the winter, this is the November, December, January outlook for precipitation. The patterns are starting to emerge that are very similar to an El Nino patterns coming out of our dynamical models, showing dry conditions in portions of Australia and South America, potentially also some wet conditions in the southern portion of the United States. This is still going to develop over the coming months, where we will have more skill as we move on into the coming months, but it's starting to emerge with some of the similar patterns that we've seen in the past with an El Nino developing. Next slide, please. But I want to remind people that historic El Nino events have a variety of winter precipitation responses. They do not match perfectly to what the average is. And this is a critical thing, particularly in a warming climate where we have ocean temperatures that are all warming and patterns are changing, that we have these expectations for certain wet conditions in certain parts of the world and dry conditions, but that doesn't always perfectly match up. And so I wanted to put this picture up of historic El Niños, and it goes from the strong at the top to the weakest at the bottom, showing that the patterns can be slightly different when you look locally. So an El Nino is developing. We need to be watching it. We need to watch what it means for precipitation and the circulation patterns that are starting to emerge from it, but it doesn't mean a perfect response of the average that we've seen before. So we need to be watching this as the time goes on and as our skill improves for our understanding of what the precipitation patterns will be. Next slide, please. But what we do have more confidence in at this point in time already is that as El Niños develop, they influence global temperature. So that warming along the Pacific, that releases the heat into the atmosphere. And during El Nino events, we typically get the warmest years per decade. So all the previous decades, when we've looked at the El Niños, the warmest year of every single decade, except for the 1970s, was an El Nino year. The coldest years were also La Nina years. So we are watching this and have expectations for it will be a warmer year as a result. And El Nino gathers strength. It strengthens and peaks in the winter season. So that warming will last into next year if we continue to have this moderate to strong El Nino potential into the winter. And so then next end of this year into next year will be warmer. Point I also want to make here, I've been getting a lot of questions about what does this mean for global temperatures? So last year with the La Nina, we had a damping of global temperatures of about 0.1 degrees Celsius by having a La Nina. In an El Nino year, you can increase global temperatures by 0.1 to 0.2 degrees Celsius. So we will be watching this closely because it could lead to this being this next year being one of the warmest years on record if you get a strong El Nino. It also could lead to global temperatures getting close to 1.5 degrees for an individual year. Now that is not a multi-year mean, it is just a single year. It will be the a high year, and it could come down after that. But it's an important point to make as everyone is watching what the global temperatures are, in light of thinking about global temperatures and trying to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius because of the Paris Agreement, which is something about temperatures staying below a threshold over a multi-decade value, but this individual year may have a very high temperature reaching 1.5. Next slide, please. What do we see in the ocean too? So far, the ocean temperatures are also really warm. If we're looking at across the equator and surrounding regions, we have temperatures are that red line. Right now, these temperatures are unprecedented across all the ocean, being at the highest temperatures they've ever been. We will see how this continues. There's some theories that it's due to changes in dust that have allowed us to get to this temperature point, but those temperatures are really warm in the ocean right now, even outside of the El Niño region. Next slide. One of the major impacts of El Niños is also hurricanes. So when you have an El Niño, typically, historically, you have more hurricanes in the Pacific and fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic due to changes in wind shear. But due to those warming temperatures, those really elevated temperatures that we have right now, next slide, please. The seasonal outlook from NOAA that came out for hurricane activity put above normal season for the Pacific, as one expects during an El Niño, but also in the Atlantic, we actually have a prediction for near normal season. That's because despite the expectations of historic El Niños, where you have damping of the amount of storms due to the El Niño, we have such warm Atlantic temperatures in the ocean that we actually have that we've put this at the near normal sense. I want to make sure that that people don't construe this to mean landfalling storms or damages of storms. This is just the total number of storms that can occur during the year. So it only takes one storm to cause damages, but the expectation is for a near normal Atlantic hurricane season due to those elevated ocean temperatures, despite the fact that an El Niño is developing. Next slide, please. So a big question that is open that we have is, how does El Niño change under climate change? I brought back this figure from the very beginning of what is an El Niño. So it is the temperature that you have in the ocean. It sets up this atmospheric circulation with these far-reaching changes in circulation, precipitation, drought around the world. It's a very complicated system with many things interplaying about the development of El Niño and its responses. We've seen over time, due to warming in the ocean, we've observed an increase in the amplitude over time. That's shown in the Oceanic El Niño Index. On the right-hand side, I have pictures from the last IPCC report of changes in amplitude of variability. How does El Niño change in time? So the different models actually are not all in agreement of what happens to El Niño over time due to climate change. And so this is a big question. It's a really active area of research to better understand how El Niño changes in time. Part of the reason that we've invested through the BIL funding in upgrading the tower rate is we're going to be taking many more measurements in this region and also many more measurements in the subsurface of the ocean to be able to better model that, better predict it going forward, and improve our seasonal predictions, but also our understanding of what develops in El Niño and how it develops in time. And this is really critical with this uncertainty of what's happening with El Niños, with this background of climate change. We need to improve that information to be able to reduce our uncertainty of expectations of how this changes into the future. And critically, with El Niños, as they start to develop and we start to look and get concerned about historic impacts that they've had, we need to be able to have this information so we can improve our predictions, our seasonal predictions, our early warning systems, to be able to understand what is happening in the ocean, what does that mean for the atmosphere, and then what does that mean for the impacts where people and society are operating on land. So this wraps up my overall science update, and I pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was incredibly helpful, although I have a lot more questions. Maybe, but I think it's helpful to know what NOAA is doing in this space, and really actually interesting to hear how recent sort of legislation has helped build more robust research on the part of NOAA. Okay, over to you, Rodney. And I think Claire will be sharing slides on your behalf.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you very much for this invitation. I would like to share with you some perspectives regarding to, of course, the occurrence of El Niño, but what is the context in the region in terms of vulnerability? The next one, please. Well, basically to talk about the regional climate context, what is happening now from the regional perspective, some vulnerability factors, and also to share some recommended actions on national level based on the lessons in the past and some final key messages. Next one, please. Well, this was presented by Sarah yet, but it's important to see and to emphasize that even there's a strong scientific documentation about the typical teleconnections of El Niño in the past. Finally, there are a lot of patterns that finally define the impacts in each region. And this is a challenge. And I am mentioning this because this is a challenge for communications and how we can really trigger actions from the governments. And all my reflections are from the point of view of the Latin American context. It's just to be clear. And yes, these are the teleconnections. We have I think, a very good knowledge based in the experience in the past about what happens in different times related with El Niño. But also we have gotten big surprises in the past, and this is important to manage in terms of really have a good reactions from governments and an effective response. Next one, please. Well, and I would like just to mention, yes, Sarah mentioned all of the conditions, the physical conditions in the ocean and the atmosphere, but I just would like to use this information for the further explanation that I will share with you. Is what is happening regionally. You know, El Niño is just starting. Just is a process that is being consolidated. But since the start of this year, the beginning of this year, the Eastern Pacific has experienced a very significant warming, and of course there is now a lot of impacts in several countries, in Colombia and Peru because the rainfall, and this warming also was fairly connected with some deficit of rainfall in Central America, which has now creating an impact, which is not so big, but it has influences. So this is the context that we have, even with El Niño is just starting. Next one, please. And when we talk more, this is a very recent image of the sea surface temperature. The anomalies that we're experiencing Niño 1+2, this subregion in front of Ecuador and Peru has been so significant, 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, and we just experienced significant impacts. And this has also contributed to generate some kind of confusion in the governments in terms of what about El Niño global, this is very typical of some regional process which is named as the coastal El Niño. And all of these kind of names and definitions and the current condition really it creates a complex environment in terms of how to inform to the governments in this subregion. Next one, please. Just to have an idea, because of this warming and without El Niño at global scale, we had these significant impacts that definitely are impacting in the economies of Ecuador and Peru. These are some pictures of what happens in the previous months. Next one, please. Well, and I in this occasion I will share some facts and some reflections that we need to take in account. How will be the impacts in Latin America and the Caribbean region, especially with this new El Niño evolving? We have it's a big region with 40 countries and territories, populations of 664.9 million of inhabitants, and a very important GDP as a whole. Next one, please. And after the pandemics, the gross domestic product, the reactivation of the country. So we are experiencing in Latin America a significant recovery of what the severe impact of the pandemics and other external conditions. But it's not the case in all these regions. South America experiences a very low growth. The Caribbean is a little bit different because the condition of specific countries. But as general aspect, there is a trend to reactivate the economies and, of course, employment, etc. So this is a condition that is now happening, but it's still very fragile, and very sensitive to external shocks. Next one, please. And what is the main characteristics that we need to take into account when we talk something about a physical event like El Niño in the an extreme climate extreme event, and what is the response? What is the other part of the equation in terms of vulnerability? And one of the main features for Latin America to consider is the high indices of poverty and extreme poverty. As you see, these indexes are quite high in the Latin American countries, but there is specific regions where this is more significant. We have Central America region, we have Mexico, and we have several of the countries that are in the Eastern Pacific coast. And when we talk about extreme poverty, the extreme poverty was exacerbated with the pandemics, and this is still not solved. This is a very old problem, but to these figures, we need to add the inequity, which is one of the main features in Latin America. This inequity, which is translated finally in the exposition to extreme events. Next one, please. These statistics and this vulnerability index, which is the sources there in that, were built to consolidate some indices related to the resilience capacity in different countries related to COVID, but are applicable to external shocks. And in this case, these indices try to really provide a quick and executive, a very objective view of the climate response capacity and economic losses of climate-related disasters in the countries. And as you see, in terms of the climate response capacity, in the left, we really have a long list of countries that are quite sensitive and limited in terms of this response capacity. And also, what is the percentage of these climate-related losses in terms of the GDP? So these external shocks are significant. And in some cases, there have been events in 2 years ago when the recovery phase is still there. And so that imposes a very challenging environment for the economies in many countries in the region. Next one, please. And when we talk about this was reported in the Regional Assessment Report in 2021 from UNDRR. When we talk about the inclusion of disaster risk management processes in law, policies, and plans, the response is more critical because we have from the 25 countries, 50% and are many key processes that are not supported by law, so are discretionary to manage. And in terms of preparedness, I think it's relatively good. Post-disaster recovery, of course, but when we talk about the proactive risk management elements, is very low. So this picture is here to just to mean that there is a strong vulnerability from the institutional and governance aspect, which is a trigger of different subsequent impacts in how to respond and how to really have an effective prevention for an external shock, in this case, El Niño. Next one, please. Well, and in terms of early awareness capacity, based in this statistics and information that we handle in WMO, from the integrated concept of the early warning systems, there is a big numbers in terms of deficit of the early warning systems in the region in South America. So we have instruments in one side, we have some information systems in the other side, but we have a lack of governance, a lack of articulation, and as a whole, the early warning systems are not so efficient in several of the countries and are not working properly, are not generating a proper response from the governments, from the local cities, the authorities, and the population. Next one, please. And this is a very key element for Latin America political risk and stability, the political cycles. As you see, the red numbers shows an average of political risk in many countries that are critical, are essential for an effective response in a big event like El Nino. Um, and, and most of the countries, at least 50 of the countries, are in that situation. So we need to consider also that during the upcoming months, there will be changes in the governments in several countries. So that means a change of authorities, but unfortunately in Latin America, in several countries, this is translated to changes to experts, to the list of key institutions that are related with the management of the response and the emergencies and how to really manage the El Nino in different sectors. Next one, please. And I would like to mention this because I was there, I witnessed and I was part of the Oceanographic Institute of the Navy when this El Nino 97, 98 happens. And we forward directly to the president, to the cabinet, to the ministers 6 months in advance because there were a strong signal and a big announcement about El Nino. And we could foresee, we saw how the response was diluting because the political problems, the institutional difficulties, and the instability. In the end, there was a poor response to the event, despite of the best prediction ever in terms of long-term range and the magnitudes of the anomalies. So I learned a lot from this experience, and I definitely I am convinced that we need not just information, we need to work in all the dimensions to ensure the best response from the countries. Next one, please. And we learned from different cases some specific actions, and I would like to share some of them with you. It's okay to talk about El Nino. It's very good to have a diagnosis about El Nino and really inform to the community about El Nino evolution and the potential strength. This is very useful. But when we need to talk about it, regarding to communications at national level, we need to translate this message in terms of forecasting, in seasonal forecasts of local weather predictions. So we need to really provide to the decision makers levels of precipitation or anomalies in the sea level or sea surface temperature very objectively with all the tools that we have, but keeping the El Nino like the main thing to predict at national level it has not worked very well. So because there are many definitions, many confusions, and in the end, the response is really weakened by this by these kind of things. And of course, one of the main problems when we have a weak governance is how to deal with the intersectoral coordination, the interinstitutional coordination, the articulation between the national, subnational, and local authorities, the coordination with the private sectors, and how to really put in the government at the highest level public policies and other instruments to incentivize prevention actions, and how to manage insurance and contingency funds. There are very structural aspects that are not necessarily taken into account by the government, and that is critical. Next one, please. Well, that's the reason, as WMO, we are promoting early warning system for all initiative. I think this is a strong complement and a strong element of a better response, but it's still underway. There are many efforts in the early warning systems, but the fragmentation of efforts is a challenge. But we are trying to deal with this in terms of a very UN-driven organization initiative with all the support of the governments to really work together in a concentration of efforts to really work in all the different pillars of the early warning system for all in the upcoming 5 years. Next one, please. And I think that is my final slide with key messages. El Nino 2023-2024 will generate significant economic and social impacts in Latin America, and that will trigger a lot of processes next year and in the next year. So multilateral financial assistance must be mobilized to implement risk retention and or transfers mechanisms at national and subnational level. It's not good to have the multilateral financial assistance when everything happened. Of course, reconstruction, recovery aspects are essential, but it will be great to have this assistance to really advocate for this kind of public policies to really mitigate the damage in the region. There is still room for governments to mitigate potential impacts and implement effective contingency plans. Strengthened early warning systems are critical to mitigate impacts. And finally, just to inform you that the UN is working with governments at sub-regional and national level at this moment to advocate for preventive actions and policy mechanisms to mitigate adverse impacts of El Niño. Next one, please. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rodney. That was a deep dive into Latin America. Now we're going to turn to South Asia and hear from Sarang Chidore. Sarang, over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Can everybody see the slide, the first slide?
It looks good. Thank you.
Excellent. So great to be here. Special thanks to Lauren for facilitating this panel and my presence here. And also very glad to share this stage with my distinguished panelists. I want to talk a little bit today about El Niño's potential impacts, but also preparedness in South Asia, focusing more on South Asia, or mostly on South Asia, which is a region I work on. But I increasingly also work on Southeast Asia. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And indeed, the two regions have connections. So the question I'm posing is South Asia ready? But first, I want to sort of start by, of course, just laying out the map of what South Asia is for those who don't follow Asia very closely. And typically, it's defined as a region stretching from Pakistan all the way to Bangladesh, including Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan. Sometimes Afghanistan is included. In the past, Myanmar used to be, but Myanmar is certainly today considered a part of Southeast Asia with ASEAN. So it's a region with some flexible definition, but certainly the area marked in green is the heart of South Asia. Now, if you look at, this is a map here of extreme weather events as recorded by this think tank called German Watch. What they do is they look at extreme events and they assess how damaging they are. They do it for every year, but they also do it as a cumulative statistic. So this map presents the cumulative numbers for the period 2000 to 2019, which is a 20-year period, and gives you a sense of where the damage has been the greatest historically through extreme weather events, such as floods and cyclones. And you can see that South Asia is really one of the red regions, dark red regions in the world. And indeed, Southeast Asia as well. If it stretches beyond to Myanmar, it stretches to all the way to the Philippines, in fact. So what can we expect, though, because of El Niño? Because El Niño, as has been pointed out by my panelists, earlier panelists, has very complex responses, very complex impacts, and they're variable impacts. So you cannot say, one certain thing about the whole world. It really depends on the local context as well. So, but we can say some generalized things about South Asia. In general, South Asia will experience predominantly more drought and extreme heat. These are going to be the dominant features because of El Niño. We have seen that historically true. That doesn't mean that's true in every corner of South Asia. There are some parts of South Asia where we will experience likely increased rainfall, but those are much smaller than the ones that historically have shown increased heat and drought. So what that means for the region, which is a vast region, by the way, it is more than, not quite 2 billion, but approaching 2 billion. India, of course, being the largest country with 1.4 billion, but other countries such as Bangladesh and Pakistan also have populations in the range of 200 million. So these are very large countries, and they're also very farming dependent. There's a lot of agricultural labor in these countries. Very large fractions of populations depend on that. So reduced agricultural yield because of drought is a major concern. There's also a major concern for water shortages. Water shortages just for domestic use, but also for industries. And in South Asia, where gender inequity is a characteristic for a long time, the burden disproportionately impacts women. And we will expect that in this cycle if predictions of a moderate to strong El Nino, as Dr. Kapnick pointed out, bear out. So that's one. But the other impact of water shortages is also on power generation. There's a real link between water availability and the generation of power. Hydropower, most obviously, but also thermal power. A lot of this region depends on coal or natural gas and requires water for the generation of electricity. So we are talking of potential impacts on quality of life, industrial output, and so forth as well. Then, of course, extreme heat means outdoor labor, which is a major part of this region's experience, both from farmers, but also a large number of migrants in cities that build around construction sites. This is a region that's generally growing, except for Pakistan. India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka are doing quite well economically. And that means there's a lot of construction in cities. The construction is often not climate friendly. And it affects labor and affects public health. And then the more intriguing aspect, which is not yet entirely established, is there are some studies we have that link increased heat to increased violence, so urban violence. These are cities with cramped populations and social challenges. So not we can't make a deterministic prediction, certainly, but this is something to watch as we get El Niños. If we get stronger El Niños, we get significant heat waves. That we just had one actually in Southeast Asia and also in India in February. Then perhaps this will be something we'll be looking at more and more. Now, when it comes to cyclones and intense rainfall, which have been the bane of some of these countries, especially Bangladesh, but also India, you're expected to see less cyclone activity than normal. Although, again, as was pointed out earlier, because we are seeing an increased mean temperature because of climate change, we may actually see a near normal cyclone period in the Bay of Bengal region. So can't really breathe easy on that, but hopefully there'll be less cyclones, which is not a bad thing, because cyclones have caused a lot of damage in Bangladesh, particularly historically, have led to losses of hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, let's come to the national plane of plans. Is this region ready? Has this region made plans? The one country I want to sort of point out in this as a sort of a star in terms of where it has traveled from where it was 20 years ago is Bangladesh. 20 years ago, Bangladesh was seen as a quote-unquote basket case in terms of natural disasters. It had, of course, the very infamous 1970 cyclone that may have killed 500,000 people. Then the 1991 cyclone probably killed 150,000 people. And the US, by the way, we were involved in disaster relief very strongly in 1991 with Operation Sea Angel. So the US played a part in saving lives, but still, obviously, the scale of the disaster was very high. Since then, things have changed dramatically in Bangladesh. In the last 15 years, there's been a concerted effort by the government to really invest in a range of solutions to mitigate the hazard, which is hard for them to control, of cyclones, into a disaster. So they have put in about $10 billion, which is a lot of money for a country like Bangladesh. This is not loose change. And they have done a lot in terms of building physical infrastructure like cyclone shelters where people can go to in every district and near many villages, embankments to protect communities from storm surges, and so forth, and also early warning systems, which are much better developed now in terms of both the government being aware of what's coming, but more important, how people are warned. The cell phone, of course, has created a tremendous vehicle for this. Technology has played a big role, but also the state actually putting in place processes, because it's not just about cell phones. You get all kinds of news on cell phones. But the question is, do people really get credible news? And do they know it's credible? And that's where I think the state has done a remarkable job. And also evacuation plans. What do they do after they know that something bad's going to happen? So all of these pieces have to come together. It's taken them, 10, 15 years of work, and international agencies have helped. By the way, this is not just Bangladesh, it's the USAID, it's other agencies, but the state has been the lead, no question. Without the state being the leading actor, none of these things can scale up. So the state has really been the leader. Recently, the country also has put out a national adaptation plan. It's not the first one. They've had others before, but this is a really comprehensive plan. Reading it, it's quite a strong plan. It covers more than just cyclones and floods, which have been the big killers in Bangladesh, but it also really covers much better drought and extreme heat. And indeed, migration, that Bangladesh, again, has been in the headlines over the years on when it comes to climate change. Bangladesh is preparing about 20 or 22 existing towns and cities to absorb the sort of migration that we are going to see, both from the extreme weather events due to floods and cyclones. But for the El Nino case, you're going to see more drought. You're going to see falling agricultural yield, most probably. And this will mean that agricultural labor of some farmers may migrate to cities because there just isn't much revenue coming from their farms. And they normally go to Dhaka, which is a city of 22 million, which can't really absorb. I was there just last year, and it was remarkable how it could even accommodate as many, but any more is going to really cause a lot of problems. So the country is preparing second-tier towns and cities to make them attractive in terms of housing, in terms of jobs, in terms of messaging, range of pieces of this have to be done, so that migrants know that there's not just Dhaka to go to, that they can go elsewhere, like city like Mongla, which nobody's heard of, even in other parts of South Asia. It's actually an important port city. That's one of the early cities they're preparing for this. So work is going on this. Obviously, the scale of hazards is coming at us apace. So we have to hope that this keeps up. India has also shown some leadership on climate action plans. One of the areas where India was an early leader in the region was heat action plans. The city of Ahmedabad in Western India in 2013 put out a national city-level plan for combating extreme heat. And now many other cities are doing the same. Although there are still gaps in these heat action plans. We can talk about that later when we have some more time, if we have some time. And as I mentioned, agricultural distress, migration because of it, and hydropower are two problems, not just in India, but also other countries like Pakistan, where the scale of the problem is vast, and solutions are only now being formulated. Implementation is a long way off still. So there's some ways to go there. I want to talk a little bit about Myanmar, because Myanmar borders Bangladesh and India, and it borders a part of India, northeastern India, that's unstable politically. We have seen a lot of violence recently in the small state of Manipur that borders Myanmar. Bangladesh has seen a huge influx of Rohingya refugees from the military operations in Myanmar, that happened in 2017 that expelled these very poor and vulnerable people. So that region of Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Northeast India is very much a sort of a zone of concern. Now, we hope that there'll be less natural disasters in terms of cyclones and floods during the next couple of years or 3 years of the El Nino phenomenon, but there may not be. So there's that there. But there's also farmers coming under stress. And the existing insurgency in Myanmar, which is very severe. Half of the country is under the control of insurgents. The military operations are in full force. Refugees have spilled over into India and Bangladesh and Thailand, indeed. So as we get these phenomena of climate change coupled with El Nino, this just adds stresses to the political and social fragility of that region, human security as well as state security. So this is something really to watch. Because the scale of problems in the region are fairly large. And in fact, in a future of 1.5 Celsius, if we get there, they're going to be even much larger. I don't think states by themselves will be able to keep up with the scales of challenges that we are going to see. We are going to need more transnational cooperation. And here, unfortunately, South Asia doesn't have the institutions. The regional organization SARC is moribund because of the India-Pakistan rivalry, which is very severe at this stage. There are alternative organizations such as BIMSTEC, which is an organization that includes, does not include Pakistan, but includes India, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Thailand, and Nepal, indeed. So it covers most of South Asia and some parts of Southeast Asia. So there's some hope for that organization, but it's still well below where it should be. For many years, it was essentially not functioning. In the last 5 years, because of India's leadership, there's been some activity, there's been some reform, there's a charter, but yet funding is quite meager at the moment, and there are many reforms needed. There are also two other organizations that are or could be more relevant in the coming years, perhaps even as early as this year or next year. One of them is a Quad, which of course the US is a leader in. US, Japan, Australia, and India form the Quad. It's in many ways seen as a geopolitical organization to compete with China, but it does have a climate and environmental pillar. And so there are possibilities where the Quad could bring some of its skill sets to bear on India particularly. And then there is the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is a much larger organization that covers many Indian Ocean states that may have a role as well. And that's a map of that. It straddles Africa, India, and then goes well beyond into Southeast Asia. Final thoughts, given the lack of time, happy to address any questions in the Q&A, but essentially South Asia shows major variations. There is not one single story. It's a vast region. I particularly want to point out Bangladesh's efforts on adaptation, but also some of India's efforts. And all states, though, are challenged by agricultural distress and migration that may and is in fact happening because of that. Transnational cooperation is really well below potential. This is where the region has to move forward on. And I would again point to regional spillovers from Myanmar most urgently, but in general, there's a strong case for Southeast Asia cooperation. When it comes to dealing with climate change, there are a lot of skills that can be brought to bear from different actors in this effort. So thanks. That's all I've got.
Well, that was a lot. Thank you so much, Surang. We'll come back to you, but it's really helpful to see some where there's been progress and sort of innovative ideas at the country level and how these could be bolstered by sort of investing more in regional organizations and so on. So let's go over to Ethiopia now to hear from Melaku Yurga. Melaku, are you there? It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. So excited to be this distinguished panelists, experts, and scientists in the field. So I'll be taking my time to speak more what that means in our setting here, Ethiopia, Horn of Africa, specifically arid, semi-arid areas where livelihood style is predominantly pastoralist, agro-pastoralist in these settings. And then where Mercy Corps also have much of its work actually. So the recent experience, as I mentioned again, in southern and eastern Ethiopia highlights what the preceding panelists actually explained in terms of what we expect from El Nino. If we take the Horn of Africa over the last 5 or so rainy seasons, roughly around 2.5 to 3 years, we have observed the worst drought in 4 decades actually. This is 5 to 6 seasons failure, consecutive 5 seasons failure, underperforming rainy season at minimum in these areas with devastating impact actually. And then remember that the way of life in these areas for people is either livestock, agro-pastoral, or mixed way of farming. So obviously, talking about droughts, water is really particularly a critical challenge. Over this period, one of the regional states where we partner and work, for instance, have been consecutively doing non-stop water tracking to meet some of the immediate needs for people as well as livestock in this kind of setting, given the impact, which also impacts or drains government resource or donor resource that was meant to be for development to meet such immediate needs. According to Famine Early Warning System Network, FUSNet, now coming to the more recent phenomena, the March-April rains we received in the highland areas of Ethiopia is 300% above the average you expect during this time of the year. Now we are talking about too much rain, which has resulted severe flooding in the lowland areas, much earlier than expected, obviously. This flooding and temperature change coming after severe droughts that I mentioned earlier had resulted in widespread livestock deaths. According to the same source, FUSNet, over 70,000 livestock deaths were reported in 2 regional states of the country, 70K. The flooding also wiped out some early planted crops, also damaged irrigation infrastructure in these lowland areas. Even when there is drought in the lowlands, floods can be very severe because there are heavy rains in the highland areas, as I mentioned earlier also. So in terms of expected impact of El Nino in Ethiopia, we are now bracing ourselves for more of the same in terms of these patterns mentioned earlier, but with a very little, with a very high actually level of vulnerability carried out from the previous couple of years that I mentioned because of the droughts. And then you can imagine the capacities of communities, systems were severely affected. And then the high temperature and drought in the lowland areas is going to compound the situation from the last 3 years, as I mentioned earlier. This is only modest, there is only modest regeneration of the rangeland where there is some decent precipitation so far. And herd size have been also badly depleted because of the drought, as I mentioned earlier. And then the drought conditions will quite quickly start to hit herds and households as well. So government in Ethiopia has spent a lot of resources, specifically one regional states, which we work closely also. Of course, we work in multiple regions. If I quote Somali region, they have to do planning and redirect resource to meet some of the earlier, immediate needs by redirecting and then doing contingency plans to meet the emergency needs. So it's not only government, obviously, international partners are also spending money in meeting the emergency responses which is trapping governments and other resources in a pattern of being unable to develop other service, rather meet immediate needs. This has implication also on the stability and other, meeting immediate needs of people, as mentioned by earlier by my colleague from Asia. Just to mention a few of the, the examples that we do in partnership with the state, USAID, as well as other partners in these arid, semi-arid, pastoral, agro-pastoral areas, and also from some of the things that we think could be done, more. Government planning process, for instance, will need to take into account forecasts, and the government sector office need to budget and plan activities. Business as usual is not going to work. So planning has to take note of this. Specifically, we have a large USAID funded activity called Resilience in Pastoral Areas. Together with CARE International, Mercy Corps is doing quite extensively, working with the DRM ministry to support and advocate for sector office, for instance, health, education, water, so that they integrate disaster planning into their strategies and annual planning. If I give you an example from one region, in Afar region of Ethiopia, public work projects under the National Social Safety Net program were redesigned to focus flood preparedness in one of the rivers, which causes serious damage quite frequently in terms of flooding. So this includes drainage canal clearing, earthwork development, and protect against seasonal floods. I think the power of information, obviously, and early warning is really essential, relying both on the formal and the traditional, sets of information. How do we push that set of information? Early warning and preparedness is one of the things we are also prioritizing. And also bringing in the digital platform where there is better mobile penetration or access to information is where Mercy Corps and our partner care are also focusing. The other aspect I want to add is in partnership with WFP, we have been working, so something to talk about around natural resource management or improving rangeland improvements to mitigate the impact of both the impact of flood and drought. So as I mentioned, in partnership with WFP, we are working with community institutions and government to support low-cost technologies for water dispersion away from flood gullies towards the drought-stricken rangelands. So by doing so, this mitigates flooding downstream and simultaneously irrigates the lowlands, allowing regeneration and improving also livestock fodder in these areas. And then one last point, of course, not the least, is again, as I mentioned, this trend has continued. So what are we doing in terms of adaptation? How does those longer term investments, be it by USAID and some of our international partners, should really adapt to enable households and systems to cope with upcoming El Nino conditions? So this is not something that can be changed quickly, I know. And then donors such as USAID are increasingly, as I mentioned earlier, investing in multi-year, multi-cycle resilience program in which we are part of as Mercy Corps. So these investments aim to transform systems that enable household level adaptation. So in the Horn of Africa, it is things like fodder. Again, I mentioned earlier the livelihood base of the community it relies on livestock significantly. So it's things like fodder production and livestock feed system and last mile veterinary services that households really need more access so that they can purchase these crucial inputs when they need them. It's also about building robust and dynamic trading systems for livestock. Here we are talking again about livestock in these settings. So households can make an informed early decision on their livestock before their body condition gets bad, based on the climate advisory they are receiving, so that they sell their animals, generate cash, which will enable them to buy, to meet other needs, as well as access, to inputs and also maintain their remaining herds. So these are some of the things we are doing, as well as things that we think we should be really prioritized. Let me stop here and thank you so much again.
Thank you, Meliku. That was really helpful. I think that point about sort of multi-year investments is going to be really critical too, to be able to invest in more resilient systems. We have a lot of questions that have come in online, and I have a lot of questions, and we only have 20 minutes. So I'm going to try to group some of these questions together and give you all an opportunity to respond. I'm going to ask you to keep your responses somewhat short so that we can try to get to as many questions as possible. That's not always easy. A few of the questions that have come in have been about sort of specific impacts and forecasting. And so I thought I'd go through those first. The one question is from Giselle Villa Benitez from Clark University, where she's a PhD student. Can you elaborate on ENSO impacts for the Amazon? Another question is from Sumini Sengupta from the she's an international climate correspondent with the New York Times. Is there a way to project which fishing areas will be most impacted? And then a third question from Brian Eiler with the Stimson Center on his question says, the forecasts focused on winter months, but what should we expect for the next 3 months across typical monsoon seasons, such as Asia's Himalayan monsoon pattern, which affects climate from Pakistan to Southwest China to mainland Southeast Asia. So, Sarah, I'll come to you first, and then Rodney, maybe to you for the fishing areas question in the Amazon.
Yeah, so on the Indian Philippines, where it's usually an El Nino leads to drier conditions, our North American multi-model ensemble, which is the dynamic models that produce the seasonal predictions around the world, that's led by NOAA and brings all those models together, actually has average to above average precipitation values in the coming months. And that is partially due to the just warm ocean temperatures that are still leading to enhanced precipitation. We're also seeing this in the Caribbean, where typically in El Nino, historic patterns lead to drier conditions, but it's also showing average above average. So this is the comment I said about what happens under climate change is with these really enhanced ocean temperatures, not just in the El Nino region, but worldwide, it's leading to some of the dynamic models giving us patterns of precipitation that are not a standard El Nino. And so that's why it's going to be really important to be following what's happening as the El Nino develops, if we get a moderate or a strong El Nino, but also what the precipitation patterns start to unfold, particularly as you move further away from the El Nino region, you're trying to understand those impacts. Those are going to be driven also by the sea surface temperatures of the ocean, but then also skill with those will go up over time. And quick comment on fisheries is that we're already starting to see the warming of the temperatures, and like if you go closer to the El Nino region, you can look, you start having those impacts sooner than you do elsewhere. Back to you for the rest.
Thanks, Sarah. Rodney.
Yes, regarding to the Amazon, we need to understand what is happening currently in the Amazon. Has been a persistent condition in terms of the increase in deforestation processes in different zones of the Amazonic areas, and also last year, as the previous ones, we had experiences a record of wildfires in the Amazon. So there is now an existing precondition some more exacerbated vulnerability of the Amazon region. But indeed, during the previous months, we have experienced some drier conditions than normal in the Amazon. And if El Nino gets more stronger with the time, that will definitely have a significant impact in the role of the Amazonia regulating the hydrological cycle. And I think that is this condition provides or generates a positive feedback in terms of the hydrological stress, and it is something to expect in the Amazon if the magnitude of El Nino really goes from moderate to strong. And in terms of the fisheries in the Southeastern Pacific, well, not at this time, this warming, despite is the anomalies in front of Ecuador, Peru are high, because of the seasonal cycle and the dynamics of the main fisheries are definitely, the impact is there, but it's not significant. But if these conditions persisted to the next 3 months, when the Humboldt current systems, the upwelling system is becoming, in according to the climatology, stronger, and this is affected by the warming, so this will be the start of more significant conditions, impacts in terms of fisheries dynamics. And there are no fixed rules for how the different species, how the fisheries will be affected, but definitely there is some displacement of these fisheries because of the warm waters, and this is now very well understood yet. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Rodney. There was a recent International Science Council report on disaster risk reduction that came out as a midterm review of the Sendai framework. And it pointed out that there's definitely been progress made over the last 7 years, but there's still a gap between the communities focused on risk and the communities focused on policy. Sir Peter Gluckman in his introduction noted sort of a few key barriers, one of them being the greatest barrier to success is the interface between risk science and decision making, and that risk assessments are not of value unless they are responded to. And sadly, there are cognitive and political biases which inhibit investment in prevention and adaptation. I wanted to come back to you, Sarang and Malaku, to sort of think about that science and policy interface. And actually, Rodney and Sarah, of course, you can chime in here too. Very relevant to the work that you're doing. But I wonder if, given the limited time that we have, if there's where you've seen progress specifically, and where you think the US and partner countries could be doing more to invest in building that sort of institutional muscle that we need moving forward, that really allows for resilience building, sort of despite political winds shifting, right? Or despite sort of economic impacts or whatever, just having some of those institutions in place that can, sorry to have a pun, but that can weather El Nino, for example. I mean, I think, Malaku, I saw that the World Food Program and USAID have both halted food assistance to Ethiopia in the sort of face of questions about food assistance being diverted from the vulnerable populations it's supposed to be getting to. And so, like, sort of where are those entry points to really strengthen institutions to ensure that they are responding to the risks as we are seeing them arise? Malaku, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can come in briefly.
Okay.
Yeah, just to specifically, as I mentioned during my closing, I mean, it's we are in a situation where compounded crises are happening. For some years, I mean, or decades, we might be dealing with probably one or two sets of crises. If I take as an example, maybe recurrent drought, which used to happen in few years' time. Now it's recurring every other year or even more, as you heard me saying earlier. Now this calls for doing development differently. I think there is now increased momentum from international partners, and more specifically, the partners we are working with, obviously the donors like USAID, looking at longer term investments. How can we really maintain the gains from these longer term investments so that we have more proactive response to some of the crises that are happening? So we can't just equate the impact of El Nino or La Nina alone. So as mentioned earlier, the human elements or other sets of calamities are also compounded. If I give you an example, you have conflict, you have drought, you have other forms of things which probably might happen one after the other, but now you experience them at the same time, and then hence vulnerability is really high. So really redirecting resource only to meet the firefighting needs is not going to take us anywhere. So there is an increased attention on how to really make investments to be more strategic, to consider that. Obviously, the big picture in terms of relationships and then partnerships are also critical. And also in the Horn, a couple of months back, USAID organized a big learning event in Nairobi where Mercy Corps took part as well. There is increased conversation around the humanitarian development peace nexus, and then an increased focus in a way that the peace element has been somehow sidelined. So it should really come up front: peace, humanitarian, and development, so that it's not HDP, it's PhD. So that is a kind of conversation happening. So these are really essential, things to pay attention on, and we are looking at genuine interest and investments as well as collaborations in this space.
Thank you, Malaku. Sarang.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. That's a fairly ambitious question. I'll try to address it to the extent I can in the time we have. I think there definitely is a gap, and this has been pointed out in studies as well. There are a lot of plans, but when does a plan translate into change on the ground, right? So we can see plans, for example, in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. But Bangladesh has really translated plans focused on cyclones and floods initially, mostly, into a lot of actual results on the ground, massive results on the ground. In India's case, there's a lot of planning. There certainly has been a lot of progress on disaster relief and HADR type stuff. But when it comes to some of these other plans, the question is, do they have the force of law behind them? And second, are they funded adequately? Is there a funding appropriations? Money talks. So is appropriations matching the ambition? And there we see a significant gap. So it's good to have aspirations and good to have plans, but I think the work is to try and fill the missing gaps here on funding and the legal force. In terms of what the US can do, I think many of these countries have the local skills and manpower to actually tackle this problem. They've shown it. In some cases, actually, they lead. We can learn something from them in the United States in some cases. So it's not that they don't have the wherewithal, but what they certainly still do need is finance. I think this is where, we know this, that climate finance is going more towards mitigation, less towards adaptation, almost nothing on loss and damage. And I think the US can really make a difference, both in bilateral ways, but also working through the international financial institutions to translate this into reality in South Asia, which is really a finance deficit region. India and Bangladesh, this will make a substantial difference. Pakistan's case is a harder challenge. There are serious problems there that nobody has quite figured how to crack. But nevertheless, at least in some of these geographies, I think climate finance can really make a difference. And the US can lead on that, and it will be noticed, and it will gain the US goodwill in the region as well. It does that. So,
thank you, Saran. Rodney, thinking about that sort of need for more robust early warning and information systems in the Latin America region, but then also the need to be able to share information in a way that's accessible to communities. And you sort of pointed to the diversity, right, of the population across the region. What is WMO doing to make that information more accessible and to sort of close that gap between risk assessments and policy?
Thanks. For us, last mile is critical. Last mile is not something that as WMO we can really work with the countries to get alone. I think the early warning system for all is an opportunity to revitalize all these partnerships at global, regional, and national level. And at the national level, the main challenge is how to really go through the different scales from the national to the local. But that imposes a challenge, is to work with different partners. And we have been working in the National Framework of Climate Services for many years, trying to implement them in the country. And the concept is applicable to this, is how to really promote more interinstitutional coordination and to bring together to the cascade, to the value chain of the services that are provided by the National Met Services, how to really reach the last mile with these different partners. So this is one of the pillars also for the early warning system for all initiative, that we will be working very closely initially in 30 target countries, and there are 6 in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. But in terms of the previous exercises, the previous interventions, we have working a lot, trying to bring the experience of the regional climate outlook from other to the national level, and from the national to really engage local stakeholders to move on.
Thank you, Rodney. And Sarah.
I also wanted to add, fundamentally, there's also some capacity building that's taking place on just the science and being able to use it through Prepare from NOAA, USAID, and state. We work with partner countries to help them develop their systems and programs, either putting in 3D printed meteorological stations, but also they come and they exchange, they go to National Weather Service, the Climate Prediction Center, and they actually receive training in the use of the seasonal outlooks and use of information to be able to make actionable information in their home countries. And that has been really critical for training up the capacity to produce the scientific information. And then as Sarang said, the key part is then taking that information once they have it and they know that they have it and putting that into action, particularly in the countries that so much of their economies are based on agriculture and are much more sensitive to changes in climate and changes in temperature. That action point is really critical to making that information usable as fast as possible in the response as you start to have one of these events unfolding.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you. And I actually, I was going to ask a final question, just as a final round, and you can throw in any additional insights you want to before we close out, but was about capacity building. I feel like a lot of the conversations I've been in recently, whether they're focused on the US domestically or internationally, there's this sense that we don't have the capacity in sort of the workforce for our future that we need, right? We're sort of, we don't have the professionalization of different fields for our future. And we sort of need to be building the human capacity in order to be able to meet the challenges of the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So I just wanted to see from your different points of view where you see capacity gaps and an opportunity to invest, right? Like where do we need the different sort of pieces of the workforce put into place? What should be students be studying in university today? What kind of internships should they be taking on so that they can be best positioned to have an impact over the next 10 to 20 years? It's kind of a random question, but I think it's an important one. And so I hope you'll go ahead, Rodney.
Thanks. I think it's a very important question. Yes, capacity building is essential in all the levels, but let me put this point from the Latin American perspective. We need to really focus in the structural issues. Otherwise, we will invest a lot of resources in several initiatives that will not get the engagement of the countries and the ownership necessary to sustain the initiatives. So definitely we need, as you see in my presentation, there is evidence of this lack of governance, legal aspects that are necessary to ensure the accountability of the governments for risk management. And we need to really build capacities before. The humanitarian side is okay, but we really need to focus more investment on try to change these structures. I think the governance models in some countries, because there are other countries that have progressed very well, have a lot of progress in the last 2 decades after 1997 El Niño, but others are still in this reactive mode, waiting for the cooperation, waiting for the humanitarian aid without doing enough in the before. So I think that is a matter of capacity building at the highest level, and invest more in this kind of proactive risk management strategies rather than in the humanitarian side, which is not the best way to really make progress and help the countries to improve. That is my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. Sarang.
Yeah, I think 2 areas, I mean, everything is important, but 2 areas where we really need a lot of attention. One, I would say, is urban planning, because the global south broadly, and certainly South and Southeast Asia, are urbanizing very, very fast. And these cities are reproducing the models of some of what we did in the US in the 1950s, which we, in hindsight, probably wouldn't have done. There's no reason why these countries need to follow those aspirational models. There are actually indigenous practices of building structures that are far more climate friendly, that can be perhaps adapted to the modern era. There's research needed and work, and indeed a norm creation, that every skyline doesn't have to look like, Dallas Fort Worth or what have you. I love Dallas, and that's, I think that there's work to be done there from all sides. The other part I would focus on is agriculture. It's very neglected. Farmers make up something like 50-60% of the workforce in South Asia, maybe less in Southeast Asia, but still substantial. In countries like the Philippines, there's actually a lot of labor is still in farming. Cambodia, Vietnam, so on. So they're often given the last place in the line because the GDP contributions tend to be, much less than the population fraction because the high value adds are all in industry and assembly and manufacturing and so on. So, but if we don't pay attention to that, half the population that is excluded can have tremendous effects politically, geopolitically, and for US interests, indeed. So those are the two.
Two great points. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks.
Sarah.
So number one, I will say climate translators that can take the physical, biological, chemical information and then put it into action for adaptation. And I'm seeing this talking to various industries. The insurance and reinsurance industries are saying this. I'm seeing it across tech. They're all saying that we have people that can be data scientists, but they don't have that insight to be able to really understand what they should be doing on this space. And number two, going back to a point Strong made on climate finance, I think we need better information on how to quantify impact, both the economic impact and the social impact of the climate finance, both mitigation and adaptation, because particularly with all the trillions of dollars that are required for this, we need to understand what the impacts are and track them and understand them so we can efficiently use capital going forward. So it's understanding what those impacts are will be really important going forward. And we don't have a lot of work on that and need more of it.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. Melaku, final word. We need you to come off mute if you're there.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yeah, nothing from my side. So as I said, it's privileged to be with you all today and share from our works and what we are observing from the impact of what is going on globally and how it affects and how it really translates into some of the things we are doing on the ground. So thank you so much. That's it from my side.
Okay, thank you so much, Melaku. And thank you all. It was really a wonderful conversation. I wish we had another hour or 6 hours. I think there's a lot to unpack here and really appreciate all the really important work that each of you are doing. And Sarah, Sarah, I did want to ask you, is there where should people go for updated information from NOAA?
NOAA's CPC website has the diagnostic that gives you updates, and it's the second Thursday of every month is when we update the information on El Nino and the status and what's expected going forward. And then there is a more detailed, more accessible blog that is put on climate.gov at the same time on the second Thursday of every month.
That's a great point. Okay, that was going to be my follow-up. And where do we find the information we understand? Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate all your important work, and thank you for being here with us today. And thanks for the whole Wilson Center team and our AV team for making this possible. And for those of you tuning in, thanks for your great questions as well. Have a great day. Thank you.